There are places where towering waves aren't needed to drown a man. Sometimes just a single wrong order is enough to sink an entire oil rig, and all the trust built with it. Calvin Drayton leaned his head against the helicopter window, silently watching the bruised ocean below Rig 7, known among the crews by a chilling name. The Lonely One stood battered against the endless sea, like an aging warrior fighting not just time, but the rotten secrets festering within. 5 years ago, Calvin believed he had bought himself a fresh start. Now all he wanted was to uncover the truth, buried beneath falsified reports, rising accident rates, and the silent departures of workers without farewell. No one spoke, no one explained. If he wanted to find out what was rotting from the inside, Calvin would have to step onto that platform himself, not as the CEO, but as a nameless worker, Kyle Dawson. Calvin Drayton leaned back into the worn seat of the helicopter, eyes fixed on the small misted window. Below, silver-capped waves relentlessly battered the rust-stained steel skeleton of Rig 7. The Lonely One, the farthest and most troubled platform among the 7 he owned. 5 years ago, Calvin had bought the entire chain from a retiring marine contractor, chasing a dream of escaping suffocating boardrooms to live a life closer to the raw winds of the sea. But lately, everything had begun to unravel. The HR reports were vague. Workplace accidents had surged. Employees were quitting so fast that HR couldn't even replace the name tags in time. No one could explain it. No number told the real story. Calvin needed answers, not from reports, not from regional managers, but from the men holding wrenches under the searing sun. No one on Rig 7 knows your face. Calvin's assistant smirked just before the flight. You've never even set foot there. They'll just think you're some out-of-work welder who got lucky. Good. Very good. With the fake name Kyle Dawson and a fabricated backstory of a drifter welder bouncing around Texas, Calvin felt like he had been handed the role of a lifetime. His beard was grown out in the style of 2 months camping without a mirror. His boots worn to the sole. His hard hat still bearing a faint coffee stain. He looked exactly like someone lucky to snag a job in the middle of a mass layoff. Even his voice had changed deeper, raspier, like he'd spent a lifetime shouting over diesel engines in 100-degree heat. The helicopter rotors slowed as they descended. Salt spray lashed the landing pad. A thick-set man with a neck as wide as a thigh and mirrored sunglasses stood waiting. There was no smile, no handshake. There was only a dry bark of a voice. Name. Calvin tightened his grip on the duffel bag, suppressing a smile. Kyle Dawson. Good Rick Malloy. Senior operator. Don't get in my way. Don't ask stupid questions. Things will go just fine. Rick turned on his heel without waiting, leaving Calvin scrambling to follow, just like a freshman trailing after a field instructor. The roar of engines, the clash of metal, the pounding of waves against the rig, all blended into a heavy, oppressive soundtrack. Calvin drew in a sharp breath, salty and bitter. His journey had begun. A journey no one was allowed to know about, until the truth was laid bare. Calvin followed Rick Malloy, the steel deck trembling beneath their boots. The sea wind lashed across the platform, heavy with the stench of oil and old metal. Rick stopped, narrowing his eyes. Name, Kyle Dawson. Calvin answered, Rules here are simple. Don't ask dumb questions. Don't fall behind. Keep up, and you live. Rick spun on his heel. Calvin smirked silently to himself. Nice to meet you, Warden. Rick. Rig 7 resembled a worn-out beast, cables tangled like a mess of uncooked noodles, oil drums left open collecting rainwater. The safety first sign flapped pitifully in the wind. Workers moved silently, faces blank and hardened. No laughter, no careless chatter. Rick barked Jared. "Shut that valve before the waves send you crying back to your mama." A clumsy young man fumbled, dropping his entire set of tools with a loud clattering crash across the deck. Rick jabbed a finger at another young man tightening bolts. Evan Show, the rookie. The ropes. If he falls, say goodbye to your paycheck. Evan, his skin sunburnt, his easy smile, a rare flicker among a sea of scowls, walked over. "Have you ever worked a blowout preventer before?" Once Calvin shrugged. "Right before the rig blew itself to hell." Evan burst out laughing. "Good one. Come on, let me show you how to mess things up right from the start." Calvin followed him, thinking silently. At least in this nest of fire ants, there's still someone who knows how to laugh. But he also knew that laugh could disappear at any moment. Evan led Calvin through a maze of rusted steel. The sea wind howled around them like mischievous children. While checking a pressure valve, Evan leaned in and spoke quietly. "Rick's been pushing us to skip some of the safety checks. Otherwise, it's a one-way ticket back to shore. No suitcase needed." Calvin tightened his grip on the wrench. His eyes quickly scanned the surroundings. Loose bolts, sagging harness lines, cracked control panels, a ramshackle rig teetering on the edge of disaster. Evan glanced around, then whispered, "Last week, Rick made me skip a leak inspection. Just because we were running late for breakfast. I refused. Result. Got humiliated in front of the whole deck." Calvin frowned. "And you accepted that?" Evan shrugged, forcing a small bitter smile. "My brother's in college. I'm paying his tuition with this job. There's no other way." They kept tightening the valves, clinging to the slippery, trembling deck. A seagull perched on a nearby pipe, staring at them with the weary indifference of a seasoned old master. Calvin chuckled softly. "At least it's freer than we are." Evan snorted, laughing under the thick stench of diesel and oil. But that laughter faded quickly when Rick's voice roared over the loudspeaker. "You lazy bastards! Move that damn body over to the pressure pump now." Calvin looked at Evan. Evan looked back at Calvin. No words were needed. Both understood whatever was rotting on Rig 7 stank worse than the leaking oil. Night fell. Rig 7 sank into a chorus of screeching metal and crashing waves. Calvin and Rick moved together through the maze of pressure lines. Rick's flashlight swung wildly, cutting thin blades of light through the thick, oily darkness. Rick barked, "We're falling behind! Skip the damn steps! Fire up the pump early!" Calvin frozen. Starting the pump early meant skipping the final safety inspection, a death game played with fate. He tightened his grip on the handle, forcing his voice to stay calm. "That's not safe. It could cause a blowback." Rick stepped in close, his breath hot and reeking of old cigarettes. "You think you know better than me?" "Rookie," Calvin answered, his voice low. "I think I know what can kill a man out here," Rick growled. "If you won't follow orders, pack your shit." "Coward." Calvin exhaled cold and steady. "I'd rather lose a job than lose my life." He dropped the wrench onto the deck with a clang and walked away, leaving Rick cursing into the thick darkness. Back in the bunk room, Calvin lay restless on the swaying bed. The stench of sweat, diesel, and rust hung heavy in the air. But it wasn't the smell that kept him awake. It was the echo of Rick's order pounding in his head. If he didn't act soon, someone was going to die. The next morning, the wind howled ferociously. Waves slammed up against the lowest deck. Rig 7 shuddered and groaned like a paper boat caught in a raging sea. Rick didn't bat an eye. He yanked the microphone and barked Evan, "Get up top and secure that tie down. Move it." Evan looked up at the gray, churning sky, then glanced at Calvin. Hesitation heavy in his eyes. Calvin stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Don't do it. With this wind, one slip, and you're gone." Evan shook his head slightly. "If I refuse, Rick docks, the whole crew's pay." Without a second thought, Calvin flung off his gloves and climbed after Evan to the upper deck. The wind slapped their faces raw. Their hands and boots slipped over slick steel. Evan's fingers trembled as he fumbled with the chain, muttering under his breath. "This is insane!" Calvin grabbed onto a steel beam, locked the final chain quickly, and pulled Evan down with him. "Done, let's get off here." Now, as they jumped down from the upper deck, Rick was already waiting for them below, a coffee mug sloshing in his hand. "You think you get to make the rules around here?" Calvin walked straight up to him, eyes locked and steady. "I do." Rick narrowed his eyes. "Who the hell do you think you are?" Calvin clenched his jaw. "The man who's going to throw you off this rig if you push one more man toward death." No one spoke. The wind howled through the empty space between them. Rick gripped his coffee mug tighter, his face reddening like an angry rooster. But he didn't fire back. Calvin turned away, pulling Evan with him. The storm still raged outside, but for the first time on Rig 7, Rick Malloy had backed down. After the shift, Calvin quietly pulled Evan into the break room. The door closed behind them, sealing out the world. Calvin reached down to his boot and pulled out a small object, a silver-edged ID badge engraved with Calvin Drayton, CEO Odell Energy. Evan's eyes went wide, nearly dropping his cup. "Wait. Drayton, Rig 7. Your Calvin nodded. "I'm the guy who owns these rigs." Evan took a half-step back, his face flushing red. "Jesus, I've been bossing around the CEO all week." Calvin chuckled softly. "And you did a damn good job." Without hesitation, Calvin keyed his radio. "This is Calvin Drayton. I'm requesting immediate dispatch of security and HR personnel to Rig 7, effective immediately. Senior Operator Rick Malloy is suspended from duty." The voice on the other end answered crisply. "Understood." 2 hours later, Rick Malloy sat slumped on the helipad, his duffel bag tossed at his feet. His face was flushed red from anger, shame, or maybe both. The entire rig crew stood at a distance, watching in silence. No one laughed. No one stepped forward. Only Evan, standing with his arms folded beside Calvin, leaned in and whispered, "I thought you were bluffing." Calvin gave Evan's shoulder a light squeeze. "I didn't come here to watch good men get thrown to their deaths." The helicopter blades began to spin. Rick forced himself to stand, didn't say a word, and climbed aboard. Calvin watched without blinking. The helicopter lifted off, and with it, a filthy era of tyranny on Rig 7 ended in that very moment. That afternoon, the entire Rig 7 crew gathered in the mess hall. Calvin stood at the front, his gaze firm but not cold. He spoke plainly. "I let too many layers form between myself and all of you. From now on, every wrongdoing, every injustice, I want to hear directly from you." The mess hall fell silent. No one chewed, no one moved. Calvin continued, "A full audit will begin today. Anyone who's ever been forced to skip a safety check, threatened, or had their pay stolen, speak up. No one will lose their job for telling the truth. An old man with a graying beard. Curtis hesitantly raised his hand from a corner table. If we talk, is it really safe? Calvin nodded. I guarantee it. Right after the meeting, Calvin and the compliance team got to work, digging deep into the safety logs, analyzing every unusual accident report, unlocking the storage cabinet where Rick had hidden files, uncovering piles of forged reports, ghost signatures, and documents buried under layers of dust. Roy, one of the veteran workers, after hours of silent hesitation, finally approached Calvin. His voice was hoarse. Frank made me falsify a few signatures. If I didn't, he threatened to strand me on the rig for months. Calvin placed a reassuring hand on Roy's shoulder. We're not living in fear anymore. By the end of the day, Rena, the medic, rushed in with a new report. We just found 7 unresolved safety tags, including a hydraulic arm with a hairline fracture. Calvin didn't hesitate. Lock it down immediately. I'll authorize the replacement. Rena exhaled in relief. For the first time in months, Rig 7 was no longer a minefield waiting to explode in the shadows. It had begun to heal. 3 days later, the helicopter touched down again. Stepping off was Carla Reyes, the new operations chief, dressed in dark navy coveralls, solid black boots, and eyes sharp as steel. Calvin shook her hand at the landing pad. Rig 7 needs a new kind of leader, not someone who shouts, someone who listens. Carla nodded, saying little. Immediately, she suspended all non-critical operations. She met with every technician, every driller. No pressure, no paperwork. Carla listened, and for the first time, the crew found the courage to speak. That night, the mess hall buzzed with conversation. No more tense silence, no more averted eyes. Calvin sat with Evan in the corner, a cup of cold coffee in his hand. You remember that offer I mentioned? Calvin asked Houston, the safety training division. I want you to help me rewrite the manuals based on real field experience. Evan smiled, part surprised, part relieved. I thought my life would always just circle around pipes and oil. Calvin gave his shoulder a light pat. Those who survive the storms are the ones who truly know how to teach others to weather them. The next morning, Calvin slung his bag over his shoulder and walked quietly through the mist-drenched steel corridors. There were no applause, no farewell speeches, just a few nods, a few glances warmer than the cold wind whipping across the rig. Evan caught up to him at the foot of the helipad, his arm still in a sling. You sure you'll come back? Calvin smirked. Not just come back. I'll stand right here on this drill deck to make sure this company never forgets that people matter more than barrels of oil. The helicopter lifted off Rig 7, shrank below the horizon. But Calvin didn't look back. He didn't need to, because this time he knew that place had truly begun to change.